Moonlight fell in slow, pale bars through the shallow sea, the long beams shifting and swaying as the swell moved above them. A row of small woven baskets rested on the pale sand, their rims dark against the milky glow of the sea floor. Inside each basket lay a few small mussels, alive and shut fast, and set there as bait, and the slow scent of them spread outward through the still water. The baskets were tied with thin hemp lines that rose up through the dim water and vanished into the dark, trembling slightly all the while. A ridged, spiny shell sat half buried in the sand a little way off, and another beyond it, and a scatter of others near a low rock furred with weed. One of the baskets swayed as something small and slow moved across the sand toward it, chiming the woven side and tipping itself in, putting out its tongue to feed and finding itself held. The water was clear and cool and full of a deep quiet that seemed to hold its breath. Far overhead, the long, slow breathing of the sea went on and on, lifting and settling against the unseen shore. On the dark surface above, a small open boat sat low in the water, with a single clay lamp burning at its stern. The flame leaned and straightened with every rock of the hull, spilling a warm orange glow across the wet planks. A man stood chest deep beside the hull, with the sand firm under his feet. One hand on the gunwale, the other walking a hemp line up, hand over hand, until a soaked wicker basket lifted clear of the water. Water ran from his hair and from the basket in thin, bright streams. He swung the basket over the side and tipped a handful of small, spiny shells into a wide pottery jar, where they slid and settled among a mass of others like them. Then he pressed a few fresh mussels into the basket and lowered the trap back down, hand over hand, until the line went slack. The basket sank through the dark water toward the sand it had left only a few minutes before. The man wiped his face with his forearm, breathed out slow and deep, and looked across the water toward the harbor lights, a low cluster of warm glows riding on the Black Sea. Somewhere, another lamp bobbed on another boat, and a low voice carried across the water, too far off for words, only the soft shape of a voice in the dark. The lamp at the stern guttered in a breath of wind and steadied again. The man pulled gently on one oar to hold the boat against the current and waited in the salt-smelling dark. From the sea, the city was a low, dark shape upon the water, a long peninsula lying between two harbors, with a broad causeway of sand reaching back to the mainland. The northern harbor curved in behind its stone mole, and the southern harbor lay open to the sea, past the stub of its old breakwater. And between them, the city rose pale under the summer stars. The great colonnaded street ran its straight, pale line through the town, its paving stones worn smooth by countless feet. And even now, in the deep dark, the columns gleamed a little where the moonlight touched them. Above the flat roofs, the temple of the city's own great god stood square and dark against the sky, its doors shut fast, the braziers cold on its steps. The shuttered shops and the quiet squares lay still, and the fine houses with their inner courtyards held only the softest sound of a fountain or a trailing vine stirring against a wall. Beyond the town, The racecourse stood long and dark against the stars, tier upon tier of empty stone. And running back across the causeway from the hills came the low line of the aqueduct on its arches, carrying the sweet water of the mainland into a city whose own wells had never been enough. The causeway of sand breathed softly on both its sides as the shallow water slid up and fell back, up and fell back, a hushing sound that never stopped. The whole city rested between its two waters, warm and still in the thick salt air. Inside the harbours, the moored ships rode easy at their cables, their hulls turning almost imperceptibly with the slow pull of the current. Furled sails hung slack from the yards, pale against the dark sky, tied fast with hemp ropes stiff with dried salt. And here and there a lamp burned at a stern, the flame doubled and dancing on the black water below. The air smelled of hot black tar and wet hemp and aged cedar wood and salt, and the faint clean smoke of olive oil. A watchman sat on the harbour mole with his back against a bollard, his lamp on the stone beside him, his cloak wrapped loose around his shoulders. The bollard's rope creaked now and then as a moored ship leaned on it and eased off again. On the deck of one of the larger merchantmen, a sailor lay asleep under the stars, with his head on a coil of rope and his cloak drawn over him, and he did not stir. Bales of wool stood stacked on the quay under a light awning, waiting for the morning, their dark shapes like sleeping animals. A stone quayside table held a wax tablet and a stylus, where a merchant had left them at dusk, and the wax still held the faint impressions of numbers and weights. The night moved gently around the harbour, and nothing hurried. A road led out past the last houses of the town to the open shore, where the dye works stood in a long line facing the sea. The wind ran along the shore here and carried the heavy sea smell of the work down the coast, though on a still day the whole city knew it, and that was why the workshops had been set out here since long ago. The heaps of broken shell outside the doors had grown over generations into low white hills that crunched softly underfoot, old shells bleached by sun and rain, the remnants of countless tiny creatures that had given up their color. Inside the largest shed, a row of leaden cauldrons stood sunk into the stone floor, each one dark and still now in the late hours of the night. No fire burned beneath them. The heat had never touched the vats directly at all. It came along a low flue from a furnace set well away down the yard, so that the liquor was held at a steady, even warmth and never ran fierce or hard. And tonight, even that far fire had been banked and showed only a deep red heart under a crust of grey ash. A thin steam still drifted off the cooling liquor, curling into the air and vanishing toward the stars. The smell in the shed was salt and wool and wet stone, and a deep, low tang like the sea held too long in a shell, and it clung to the beams and the walls. But outside on the shore, the night air was clean and cool, and carried only the salt of the open water and the faint, dry scent of wild thyme from the hills. An old dyer sat on a low stool near the door of the shed, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes half closed. He knew by the smell alone when a vat was ready, and could not have explained how he knew, any more than a sailor can explain how he reads a coming wind. Beside him, a boy had fallen asleep on a heap of old sacking, his head pillowed on his arm, and a small dog lay curled on the warm stone near the threshold, with its tail over its nose. The work of the dye was patient and slow, and full of waiting. Each small shell held only a single tiny drop of clear fluid, held in one slender vein at its throat, and nowhere else in the whole small body. And the catch of a whole night might yield no more than a thin film at the bottom of a jar. The boatman brought the jars up from the shore in the cool early morning, and the catch was tipped out and sorted by hands that knew the difference between the ridged and the smooth, the large and the small. For the two kinds did not give the same color, and each was worked in a vat of its own. Then the shells were cracked, and the slender veins drawn out, the smallest of them crushed shell and all. And the dyers stirred coarse salt through the pale liquor, and set it aside to stand 3 days, and no more. For they held that 3 days gave the liquor its strength, and a fourth began to take it away. Nothing seemed to happen in those 3 days, and yet something was happening that could not be hurried. Then the leaden vats were filled, and the far furnace was lit, and for 10 days together the liquor was held at that gentle, steady warmth, skimmed and tended and watched, until it was clean enough to try. An extraordinary number of small shells had to go into a single narrow hem, and the city had been gathering them from the sea since before anyone could remember. A pale skein of wool hung from a long pole beside the vat, dripping slowly onto the stone floor. It had gone into the liquor twice. First into the half-cooked vat, while the color was still green and unripe, and then, still wet and heavy, down into the second, and only cloth that had been given both baths was called twice dipped, and went to the merchants under a separate seal. When it came out it was yellowish and faintly green, like sea foam or the inside of a certain shell. But as the air touched it, the color began to change. The green deepened to a watery blue, and the blue darkened slowly toward violet, as though the wool were remembering something it had always known. The old dyer watched without moving. The skein hung there breathing in the night air, and the color kept coming, slow and sure, until at last it was the deep, dark purple red that the world came to this shore to find. In shadow it was dark as clotted blood, almost black. But when a lamp was held behind it, the cloth glowed a deep, rich violet, like the heart of a flame. The dyer reached out and turned the skein gently on its pole, and the light from the doorway caught it and burned in the color for a moment before it swung back into the dark. The wool smelled of the sea and the fire and something else that had no name. The dyers said it did not fade as other colors faded, neither in the sun nor in the washing, and that a good hem could outlast the man who wore it. And in the long, warm dark of the workshops, when the far fire was low and the vats were cooling, the old dyers sometimes told the story of how the color was first found. It was a story worn smooth as a pebble by the telling, the kind of thing a grandmother murmured by a low lamp while a child's eyes grew heavy. A story everyone in the city knew and had always known, the way they knew the shape of the harbor or the smell of the sea at low tide. It was a warm, golden evening long ago, on this same sand, with the same low waves coming in and going out. The great god of this city walked easily at the water's edge, with his feet in the wet sand, and beside him walked a young woman of the shore, with her hair loose and the evening light warm on her face. The god was tall and warm and walked at ease, his hand sometimes brushing a stalk of dry seagrass, his feet leaving deep prints in the damp sand that the next wave softened and erased. And ahead of them a dog ran in the way dogs do, nosing among the wet rocks and the weed, snuffing at a crab that scuttled sideways into a pool, pawing at a clump of bright green sea lettuce, its tail moving in a slow, happy sweep the whole time. The dog found a small, ridged shell wedged in a crack in a rock pool, and it took the shell in its jaws the way a dog will take anything interesting, for no reason but the joy of the cracking. The shell broke with a tiny, sharp sound that no one heard, and the dog worried at it a moment longer, and then it came trotting back along the sand toward the two who were walking, pleased with itself, its tail sweeping. And when it came close and lifted its head, its whole muzzle was stained a color that neither of them had ever seen, a deep, dark red that turned to violet as the evening light moved across it, rich and strange and glowing, as though the dog had been drinking the last of the sunset. The young woman stopped walking and put her hand on the god's arm. The dog sat down in the sand and looked up at them with its purple mouth and its bright, pleased eyes, entirely happy. The god knelt down in the sand and turned the dog's head gently in his hands, and the color was on his fingers now too, a rich, dark smear that caught the last gold light of the sun and turned it into something else. The young woman knelt beside him and touched the color on the dog's muzzle with her fingertips. And she looked at the stain on her own hand, and she said that she would have a garment dyed in that shade and in no other, and that nothing else in the world would do. The god looked at her, and at the sea, and at the small broken shell lying on the wet sand, and he understood. So he went down among the rocks in the shallows and gathered the little ridged shells one by one in his hands. And the young woman held the fold of her skirt to carry them. And when they had enough, they sat on the warm sand together, and he drew the color out of them with salt and patience and the warm evening air, and dipped a length of white cloth into it and held it up. And the cloth came out dark and glowing, the first purple thing in the world. He gave it to her, and she wrapped it around her shoulders, and the color glowed in the fading light like the sea itself at dusk. And the dog lay down in the sand at their feet and slept. That was the whole story. No battle, no monster, no great labor. Only a dog with a purple mouth coming back along the sand, and a color noticed and asked for, and given as a gift. And ever since, they said, this shore had given up that color to patient hands. The same little shells were still found among the same rocks, and lifted from the same sand by the same kind of woven baskets, swaying on their lines in the cool, clear water. The whole long labor of salt and fire and waiting was only the slow human way of doing what the dog had done in a single joyful instant on a golden evening long ago. Cracking the shell, releasing the hidden thing inside, letting the air work its slow wonder on what had been colorless. Every boy carrying a jar up from the shore, every old dyer stirring a vat by lamplight, every merchant sealing a bale on the quay, every woman winding a skein of dark wool in a warm room, was somewhere in the middle of that one old story. And the shell hides its colour until it is opened, the way the night hides the day. And the pale wool darkens slowly in the air, the way the sky goes from green to blue to deep violet at dusk. And the patient waiting of the vats is not so different from the patient waiting of a sleeper for sleep, each thing given time to become what it is meant to be. The little baskets left on the sand overnight and lifted full before dawn rhyme with rest itself, which is left down in the dark and comes up changed. The city knew this without ever needing to say it, the way a body knows its own breathing. On the quay, the bales of dyed wool sat waiting for the morning, their wrappings dark and rough and ordinary, hiding the deep colour folded inside. When the sun rose, the merchant ships would take them aboard, and the great sea road would carry them south along the coast to Alexandria, and west past Cyprus and Rhodes, and the long shores of Greece, past the strait at the end of Italy to Puteoli, and on to every harbour that could pay. And one day a narrow band of this colour would edge the robe of a magistrate in a cold northern town, whose people had never seen this sea, whose sky was low and grey, and whose winter was long. Or it would run along the border of a freeborn child's toga in a city far inland, a child who had never heard the name of this shore, and would never know that the purple on the hem had begun as a tiny clear drop inside a spiny shell on a moonlit seafloor half the world away. A whole shore's patient nights were folded into that one small band of colour on a distant shoulder. And the shore gave it up quietly, night after night, to hands that were willing to wait. In the deep quiet of the night, the last people awake moved slowly through their small tasks. The watchman on the harbour mole lifted his lamp and looked out over the dark water, saw nothing but the slow swell and the riding lights of the boats, and set the lamp down again, and the flame leaned a little in the breath of sea air and then straightened. A fisherman sat cross-legged on the deck of his boat, mending a torn wicker basket, threading a strip of wet reed through the weave, his fingers working in a rhythm he did not need to think about, the lamp making a small circle of light around his hands and leaving the rest in darkness. An old woman climbed the steps of a small shrine near the shore and trimmed the wick of the lamp that burned there, and the flame shrank and then burned steadier for her care, and a moth moved around it in slow circles. A mother sat up a while by a sleeping child, her hand resting on the child's back, not thinking of anything in particular, listening to the sea breathing beyond the window. A baker opened the door of his oven to bank the coals for the morning, and the red glow spilled out onto the street and vanished when he closed it again. A dog turned round once on the warm stone of a doorway across the town and settled with a long, soft sigh. And far off across the black water, another dog answered it once and then let it go. The long, colonnaded street lay empty and pale under the stars, the columns standing in their quiet row like old men who had seen everything and were no longer surprised. The shuttered shops gave back no light. The fine houses with their cool floors and their inner gardens held only the sound of water dripping into a stone basin. and that very softly. The temples stood with their doors shut fast, the ashes in the braziers long cold, the offerings of the day taken away. Beyond the town, the racecourse lay enormous and quiet, its tiers empty, the starting gates closed, the raked sand of the track smooth and untouched until the morning. On the causeway, the water breathed in and out along both sides, a hushing sound that had been going on for longer than the city had stood there. In the dye works, the vats had gone still under the stars, and the hanks of wool hung dark and heavy on their poles, swaying barely in the night air, and the boy on the sacking did not wake, and the small dog did not stir. A last lamp burned in an upper window over the harbour, and then that one went out too, and the square of light was gone, and the stars were there again. The city lay between its two waters and asked for nothing. The warm dark drawn over it like a blanket up to the chin, and nothing was asked of it but to breathe. Down below the surface, the moonlight still fell in slow, pale bars through the shallow sea, and the little woven baskets still sat on the pale sand with their bait inside them, swaying slightly on their lines. A ridged shell shifted in the current and settled again. A faint blue-green light stirred where the water moved, and something small and slow crept toward a basket and tipped itself in. Far above, the long swell passed over without sound, lifting and settling, a rhythm as old as the shore. The baskets waited in the cool, clear dark, patient as the night itself, and the sea went on above them. The sea went on.